seaweed expert with a particular interest in green seaweeds. But over the years, he's amassed a huge amount of experience and information on the shores of the Firth of Forth. So he's going to tell us about some of that tonight. So hand over to you, Martin.
There we are. Thank you, Claire. Let's just get my screen up. Share the screen. There we are. Right, what I'm really going to be talking about is the impact of coal mining on the seaweeds of the Forth. I've always been interested in how we can use seaweeds to monitor the ecological quality of the environment and things like that. So I'm always interested to see what effect different industries have on it. Now, it's not wanting to go on to the next slide.
I believe there is a trick where you can click again on something.
Ah, there we are. Here we are. Yeah. So, you know, if you talk to most people about pollution on beaches, they think it's probably going to be sewage or something like that. But coal mining does it too, though only in selected places. And I'm going to look at effects on the seaweed flora, and we're going to study the recovery from those effects. But I think, first of all, I ought to give you a quick look at the seaweed so you know what to expect to find on a shore. Now, I know 3 weeks ago, many of you would have been present at the society at the lecture on that from Claire. So I'm not going to go through all that again, but I'm just going to give you a quick summary of some of it and a few pictures to get people into the spirit of it. So how many seaweeds do you think there are on a shore? Well, it varies because shores have different physical makeups, but the usual range on a good shore in Britain, habitat diverse and clean, would be between 50 and 90 species, average about 70. But you know, you've got some much bigger ones, as you'll see shortly, in the outer reaches of the Forth. Now, in the Forth, we have the latest count I've done, about 276 species in the 20th, 21st century, of which, you know, there's 640 in Britain. That's a pretty species-rich area. And these are probably much bigger numbers than many people realize. So how on earth do we get such big totals on a shore? Well, 2 reasons. One, the diversity of the environment with lots of subhabitats, and 2 great gradients of immensely varying ecological conditions, from aquatic to terrestrial and from salt water to freshwater as you go up the intertidal zone from the bottom to the top. So there's environmental diversity, but there's also seaweed diversity. The seaweeds are actually an incredibly complicated group with many forms in them. Seaweed isn't actually a technical botanical term. It's a convenience term, which means all those algae that live attached to rocks and intertidal and shallow subtidal seashores. I say shallow subtidal because, of course, they can only live where there's light penetrating the water. And we've got 3 major colour groups in that: the green, the red and the brown. And you need to remember that because we're going to be counting the numbers in these different groups on coal-affected shores later. But first of all, let's just say, I'm repeating something Claire said here, the morphology of them differs from single cells, which are about 1/100 of a millimetre long, right through to the giant kelp, which you saw in one of Claire's slides a few weeks ago. We don't have them in Britain, but they're up to 70 metres long and can grow 1 metre a week. Those are incredible plants. And you've got all these other forms I've listed there in between, including encrusting ones on the rock surface, including plants that bore into mollusk shells even. That's what I did my PhD on, so I'm bound to mention that. Plants that live inside other plants, on the outside of plants and so on. We're going to have a look at some slides of those now. But one point that's very important to make here is that some of these things you see in that list are not big and easily seen. So you can't do a full list of species for a seashore without using either a very good hand lens, but preferably also microscopical examination. So let's look at the diversity of the shore and the diversity of seaweed types. This is a typical view of the tidal range going up the shore, and you can see there's different zones indicated there at different heights on the shore, because all these different zones are physically very different environments because of this immense gradient you have from low tide to high tide. Low tide almost all completely in seawater, high tide almost always out of it, plants drying out. But also, as you go up the shore, you'll get more exposure to fresh water, either through land runoff or through rain. So as you go up the shore, it becomes an environment of greater change in salinity as well. And since the organisms that grow on the shore are marine, they don't like it as you get higher up the shore. So there's fewer species, only the tolerant ones grow up there. And the ones you get at the very top are to some extent the same green species that you find go all the way up an estuary into low salinity there. But another point about this is it means the bulk of the species, when you're looking at a seashore to collect them, are living in the bottom half. As you go up the shore, the number of species gets smaller and smaller. You'll see that comes in later, a little bit of importance, because there are a couple of these shores I'm going to talk about in Fife where the top of the shore has been reclaimed as part of coastal protection, but the bit that's been lost is, if you like, the species poor area of the shore. So anyway, those zones are largely dominated by big seaweeds. They belong, if you want to be technical, to the fucoid group of algae, but many people will just know them as rockweeds. And some of these you'll recognize here, those of you who go on shores, and they're characteristic, different ones of different heights on the shore. But below that last picture I showed you, that didn't go quite to the bottom, we've got the kelp zone in the very low intertidal and in the shallow subtidal. And this is a place where I think there's beautiful kelps. I'm afraid it's not quite in the Forth. It's in Petticoat Wick near St Abbs in Berwickshire, but it's a beautiful place when you get a low spring tide there, and you can see the kelps there. Now, the basic seaweed types, then we've got the kelps in the top right picture, the fucoids or rockweeds in the bottom left, but we've also got reds, look at them, foliose and filamentous ones, and we've got red ones, which are gelatinous, foliose, filamentous, and so on. And here's to give you a bit more variation of, these are not all from the Forth, I hasten to add. Some of these are actually from elsewhere in Britain, but it gives you some idea of the diversity that we get in seaweeds. But if you actually look at it on the shore, then this is what you'll see on a good shore. It's actually quite complicated. You've got different layers of vegetation. You've got the bigger ones overlying the smaller ones. You've got ones in rock pools. You've got turfs on the rock surface, which if you examine them microscopically, will show you a lot more species in them. We've got the rock pools, that's very important subhabitat. And if you look at some of these pictures, the things you see in the pools are not the same as on the rock immediately surrounding it, because of course the rock pool is full of water all the time, even when the tide's out. But it also, the higher up the shore you go, the greater are the chemical and physical changes in the rock pool when the tide is out, because it's exposed to the atmosphere, the sunlight and so on for longer. So different species can be adapted to rock pools and on the open rock surface. And the ones which can survive there change with the height on the shore. So that's another way we get lots of species on the shore. But there are some pools, like you see in the bottom left corner there, laden with sediment. The sediment just stops there being many things in there. At least that kind of sediment does in suspension. But if you look at the next slide, the top right corner, that's got a kind of sediment. It's a sandy bottomed pool. But doesn't it look clear and lovely? Look at all those seaweeds in it. And sandy bottom pools have, again, their own species adapted to living in that kind of situation. But you can see from these rock pools you see here, the bottom left one particularly, has got some kelps in it. And this is what you get on the lower shore, species from the subtidal, some of them, not all of them, but some of the subtidal species can actually creep up the shore into the intertidal in rock pools. Now there's a turf. I mentioned the turfs earlier. You can perhaps see that there's red there, but that red is not one species alone. Look at the next slide. Look at these, all quite different from each other, and they could all be in that turf. These are all ones you find in turfs. And look how different they are when you see them microscopically. That's why you have the need for microscopic examination. This is a beautiful picture here. I reckon I could get at least 15 species out of that. To you, it might just look a bit of sandy mess with some fucoids, some rockweeds over it, but believe me, there's a lot more there. Now, the calcareous ones too are another world. You might mistake some of them, the top left picture, pink encrustations on the rock. You might even think it's something geological in the rock. No, it's not. It's algae that secrete the calcium carbonate skeleton around themselves. And you can see there's two types in that top left picture, but there's also something red on the rock, another red encruster, which isn't calcareous, isn't pink. On the right-hand pictures, the filamentous ones, corallina is magnified at the bottom to show what a filament of it is like. It's like a pile of calcareous boxes, one after another along the filament. Those aren't single cells, those calcareous boxes. They're quite hundreds of cells in each one. And now they are in a pool at the top. Ones which live inside animals, there's a progressively increased magnification going from the bottom left clockwise right round here. It's actually a colonial animal. You see it slightly enlarged in the top left by itself, and it's red there, and that's because, if you look at the next picture, it's got red filaments growing in it, which are magnified at the bottom. There's quite a number of, well, not quite, there's a small number of red and green seaweeds which live in that kind of habitat. Here we've got ones that live in shells. You might find this amazing that they bore little tubes through the calcareous part of the shell and live in it, either big single-celled ones like at the bottom of the screen or smaller filaments at the top. It's not just green ones that do this. Cyanobacteria do this, and also one group of red algae do that. There's some typical encrusting brown seaweeds living on a limpet, but they also live on the rock surface. Epiphytes are plants that live on other plants. And this is very important for bulking up the number of species on a shore. In the bottom right, you can see quite large red ones living on the bladderwrack, Ascophyllum. They're easily visible with the naked eye. The top left, you've got some rockweed, some fucus there, with a green coloration on it. That's because it's dried out. But if you took that fucus and put it in a polythene bag with some other wet seaweeds to take it away back to the lab, the green color would vanish. You wouldn't know it was there, and you'd have to scrape the surface to find it. But if you do that and put it under the microscope, then that's what you get there in that picture just below. Ulithrix filaments, a green seaweed enlarged. So it's important when sampling a shore to look for these epiphytes. There's Cladophora, the green weed on the left, which is just that one species of Cladophora is just about doable with the naked eye. So people might not always bother to take it back to the lab, but if they do and put it under the microscope, they're likely to find things like you've got in the bottom right picture there, a species of Auduinella that's epiphytic on Cladophora. So these are the ways we get so many species. Here's one's endophytic in other green algae living inside other algae, which have been squashed to take these pictures. So what sort of seaweed assemblage made up of all these different things would we expect to find on an unimpacted shore? Well, number of species we've already covered, 50 to 90, average 70, but you can get much richer shores, and you'll see this in the outer Forth later on. Shores like Ely and Dunbar are well over 100 species. Pillar groups, we expect all three to be present, but on a healthy shore, there's a specific ratio about them. There'll always be more red than brown, and more red or brown than green. I put an approximate off the top of my head ratio of 6 red to 3 brown to 2 green there. But what you will find is that on more polluted shores, or shores at an early stage of colonization, the reds will be down and there'll be more greens. And this is what we're going to see when we look at some of the coal-affected shores in the Forth. So look out for that. We'll expect all the types of species have gone through to be present. Seasonal change, yeah, it does change with time of year. You get the most in the summer, particularly the late summer, and December, January, February, you get low numbers in our temperate climate. Year-to-year variation. Now, what we've found is that if you provided you sample the same shore each year at the same season, you'll get approximately the same number of species. But the strange thing is it won't necessarily be the same list, not the same names. And we're going to come to this at the end when we look at what makes a baseline we might expect a polluted shore to recover to. But the species richness, that is the number of species on the shore, will be broadly similar from year to year, but there'll be perhaps about 30% of the species are different, made up particularly of red species which come and go. We tend to refer to them as ephemeral species. Anyway, we expect 60 or more species, red, greater than brown, greater than green, and a full range of types. And we can also base this on looking at shores near the coal-affected ones. Now, let's look where shores have been affected by the coal industry. Three major areas: Northeast England, West Cumbria, and Firth of Forth. I think the Northeast England is the best known. I think the Firth of Forth is not that much known except to people in Scotland that this has happened there. Let's look at what the coal industry actually does. There's two types of waste, solid and liquid. Waste minestone, ground up rock with coal in it, dumped in land usually at coal mines. This gives rise to what in Scotland are called bings, what are called, in where I come from in Northern England, are called slag heaps. But no, not always when they're on the coast. They just tip it on the beach. And you'll see some pictures of that shortly. So that is a serious pollution problem. Liquid wastes, well, coal washing produces some solids into the water it's disposed of to, the sea and coastal collieries. More importantly, it's the drainage that keeps the mines pumped dry. But if a mine is actually busy working, the water which is pumped out to keep it dry hasn't been in it very long. The real problem comes about with abandoned mines when pumping ceases and they fill up with groundwater, and it starts to undergo chemical changes in the mine involving bacterial growth, producing acid, so reducing the pH of the water, making it more acidic, in other words, dissolving iron out of coal-bearing rocks, which are often rich in the element iron, and eventually it fills up and bursts out of the mine, and deoxygenated water comes out with high levels of iron in it and low pH, acidic water. And as it oxygenates, when it comes to the surface, the dissolved iron oxidizes and changes from the soluble form to the insoluble form, which precipitates out as an orange dust in suspension in the water. And that has a serious visual effect. It's sometimes called acid mine drainage, but you might see later that it doesn't have always such a big effect on seaweeds in estuaries maybe, but it does on the open coast, in an example you'll see in the East Neuk. So what does it do to the seaweeds then? Well, the most dramatic physical effects are really as it affects the availability of habitat. It can bury the existing rocky habitat. A solid bedrock shore, which is good for seaweeds to attach to, can actually get covered with shingle from the rock. The more turbidity in the water column cuts down light, and particles from this turbidity can settle out on the rock and stop seaweeds attaching, can go in rock pools and inhibit their flora and fauna. The shore area can actually get bigger because of what's being dumped, and it can stretch out into the sea. You can get the seaweed movement of the high water and low water marks. And something that I believe has happened in Northeast England, maybe it has or hasn't happened in Fife, is that the old shore can even subside as it's being buried because of the collapse of the mine workings underneath and the weight of the dumped material on top. So that after the mining stops, the dumping stops, and the dumped material starts to erode away, it's not exposing the old shore that used to be there because that's sunk due to subsidence. So effects on the seaweed then: loss of habitat, a smothering effect. So we lose species. In fact, we lose whole communities. Some of the worst affected shores have got only a handful of species on them. And also sometimes we get green tides, a massive growth of green algal species and little else, which when it happens on a mudflat in an estuary or in an enclosed area like Montrose Basin is regarded as a nuisance, because when it happens on a muddy shore, it inhibits bird feeding, but it's not such a problem on the shores that in that way in rocky shores. We're going to look at three different situations in the Forth. There's sometimes people call the coast between Kirkcaldy and Leave and the coal coast, the Fife coal coast. And that's because it used to have three very big 20th century coal mines on it, which were quite clearly visible. And which survived until between 1967 and 1980 or so, when they were closed. One of the problems we have with that bit of the coast is that the 19th century botanists who looked at Forth seaweeds omitted that bit of coast. They never recorded anything there, wrote any papers on it. So we don't really have a previous baseline to tell us what to expect there. Another second thing I want to look at is to go to St. Monans in the East Neuk, lovely part of Fife. You wouldn't think that was a mining area, but it used to be back in the 18th century. And the extent to which acid mine drainage can remain polluting till decades after the mine has closed is particularly shown there by an example at St. Monans. Some of you may know the windmill and the salt pans at St. Monans. Well, the coal mine that was associated with them 200 years ago, there's still mine water discharging from it onto the shore, and it's still slightly acid. We'll have a look at that. The third thing I want to look at, the third way the coal affects the shore, is through the drainage from inland mines in the central Fife coalfield through estuaries into the Forth, particularly the Leven and Keithingburn estuaries. And I'll talk only at the Keithingburn at Inverkeithing because we've got more information on that. Oh, here's the Fife coal coast. The Francis Colliery at Dysart closed 1984. The Michael at East Weems closed 67. The Wellesley Colliery at Buckhaven or Methil closed 1968. All three of them dumped spoil directly on the shore, but you can see also for the Michael Colliery there, you've got the little insert showing a massive mine water discharge from the top of the cliff of dumped spoil, which actually continued till 1996 after it had closed, when it was piped inland to treatment lagoons, which were built on the site of the former Francis Colliery at Dysart, which you can see on the other little insert in an aerial photograph there. You'll see a bit more of them later on when we come back to look at the shore by the Francis Colliery at Dysart. But let's start with some pictures of the actual dumping of the spoil. The two left-hand ones, the black and white ones, are two Fife collieries. Wellesley Colliery at Methil at the top, Michael Colliery at East Weems underneath. I want to compare what you're seeing about Fife with what happens in Cumbria and County Durham as well. So on the right-hand side, I've put two pictures of Easington Pit in County Durham, or at least how it got rid of its waste onto the beach. Several collieries along that part of the Durham coastline had overhead conveyors to put coal on the shore, and you can see that there at Easington. You can see what had happened to the shore. It's gone out of existence, except it hasn't now because it's come back due to a project called Turning the Tide that they had in County Durham to restore the coastline. Anyway, let's go to the Wellesley Colliery then. The dumping stopped in the late 1960s, but we lost the shore that was there where it used to happen, that we might have been able to look at recovery on, because there was, as you probably know, an oil construction yard built there. That's now passed by the way, but it's become other things. You've heard some of the stuff about Bifab and the windmill construction recently. That would have been happening there had it happened. We studied the recovery of that from 1999 to 2019, but the study area we used had necessarily to be a little bit away from that site because the actual site itself was under these other developments. Let's have a look where we went. There's these. The National Library of Scotland's got a super map section where you can download out of copyright ordnance survey maps, virtually everyone that's ever been published on Scotland, so it really helps this kind of survey. 1911, extensive solid bedrock shore everywhere. Look at 1966. It's all gone, it's all buried. Look how the symbol for the shore has changed. 1984, it's not just that. Look, there's a little bit by the red arrow, which is the working area we had in 1984. Some of the rock is reappearing as the dumped stuff vanishes, but look how we've lost the whole top of the shore. It's solid white there. That's because land has been reclaimed there. Let's look at it a bit closer up. Sorry, these are the wrong way round. The later ones on the right and the earlier ones on the, no, the later ones on the left and the, you can see the dates on them. I get red and left and right mixed up sometimes. So, look, 1911, this is an important bit. Look how the shore goes right up to something called Shore Street. Look at Shore Street on the next one. Yes, it's dumped stuff on the shore that goes up to it. But look at the next slide, the one on the right, the most recent one. Look, that bit up to Shore Street is now green. It's been reclaimed. This is something we've got here and at East Weems, is that if you look at the top left picture there, that green area, it's coastal protection works that have been built, have reclaimed part of the land. So that's been built over the dumped colliery spoil. And in front of it, looking out to sea, you've got the dumping of boulders as part of the coastal protection. The upper part of that intertidal rocky seashore has been completely lost and replaced with those boulders. So you might think that will reduce the shore's ability to hold species. It doesn't completely, because those boulders, something will grow on. But I did point out to you in that picture of Aberdour seashore much earlier that that's a part of the shore we don't expect much species on. But as the spoil is eroding away, look, rock pools are being exposed, look on the right, and bedrock is being exposed. So how's that affecting the species? Look, 3 surveys I've put up here, 2000, 2011, 2019. Look how few species there in 2013 species. That's not 50 to 70, 50 to 90 every 70, is it? By 2019, it's got to 41. But look, red 14, green 15, they're equal. No, it's not got there yet by a long way, but it is getting there. That's the important thing. It is recovering to what a normal seashore might be like, but it's not got quite the right makeup of species yet. The missing 30 or so species are all likely to be red ones. Right, let's move to East Weems, 2-3 kilometers away. You saw that earlier, that closed 1967. You saw that slide of the continuing mine drainage water. There's 2 shores we've looked at here. There's actually a solid bedrock shore in the village itself. I think it's a beautiful little shore, that one, about 1 kilometre away from the mine. But there's also the boulder shore underneath that gushing mine water you saw earlier. We'll look at the 2 of them in succession. Well, actually, first of all, this slide will show you where the 2 of them are. Eastern Bedrock site and the discharge site on the boulder shore. And see how in 1893, before this mine had got going, beautiful solid bedrock shore all the way along the coast. 1959, very different. Look, you've got a dumped spoil on it. I think also there was a problem possibly with stuff from the colliery at Methil coming along here as well, drifting along. Now, let's look at the shore in the town. It's changed a bit. Those 2 photographs on the side, 1910s and 2019, I've tried to take them from approximately the same position, but look at the difference. Coastal protection works have built up a massive boulder placement on the top half of the shore, and you can see in the bottom right picture where that is, again, got the green grass. But the actual bedrock shore there is a very attractive one. And if you look at that top right picture, you've got kelp, you've got sublittoral things in the rock pool. This is actually really quite a nice shore, which is clearly, when you look at the rock pools, you get a feeling of goodness on this shore, that this is really recovering. Let's have a look at the species. Yes, it is. Look at that. The bottom total in 2019, 58 species. That's a very auspicious day. I found 58 species there. That's 2 years ago. Gosh, 2 years and 2 months. Because I remember that only too well, because the shore has actually got a bit of slippery mud on it. And I was standing by a rock pool, which was about my height and width, 2 meters long and about 1 meter wide. And I slipped on the mud and fell backwards entirely full length into that rock pool, which I'm not forgiven the shore for that yet. But I jumped out very quickly because I didn't want to get so wet. I wouldn't have time to go to the other shore. But no, seriously, looking at this, the species number has doubled 1987 to 2019. No change from 81 to 87. But remember, there was quite a lot of pollution still going on there then. But it's gone up considerably to 2019. But look, the reds, no, the reds have not gone up enough yet. So I think there's still plenty more to come there to bring it up to the level that we start to get at somewhere like Largo. just on the other side of the Leven estuary, where we get 70 odd species quite easily on a shore there where the rocks just stick out of sand. Now move down to the colliery itself, a kilometre away. Here you can see the incredible change from the solid bedrock shore 1893 to the dumping site in 1959. Look at just to the south of this, continuing the map on, you can see the same again. I just put both of those in because they, the whole area we surveyed includes bits of both of those maps. Incidentally, these maps, it's interesting if you've not seen this on the National Library of Scotland website, you can actually get dual maps like this side by side. You can select two maps to have side by side. And if you magnify them, they both magnify to the same amount. If you move one around, the other one moves to exactly the same location. So it's really good for making comparisons of the same place at different dates. It really is. It's a stunningly good website, the National Library of Scotland's Maps one, I think. So let's look under the cliff there. The bottom left picture shows you very clearly what the cliff is, where that spoil was dumped. You can see the red and the black mindstone in an eroding cliff. And that's been going on to try and giving it a shingle and small boulder covered shore there, which wasn't that beautiful for seaweed colonization. And on top of that, until 1996, was it I said, you actually had that mine water cascading over it too. But since that was turned off and taken to Francis Colliery, the erosion of the dumped stuff from the shore has been helping. The lower shore, if you look particularly in the top right picture, you can see rock pools starting to appear. So this isn't advancing as much as the last shore you saw, but it is doing so if we look at the species totals. More than doubled in 20 years, but still a long way to go. But then it is a boulder shore, and there's an enlargement of that mine water that was coming out, and you can see the deposition of the orange iron solids on the shore there. Now, the last one of these coal mines, Dysart, the Francis Colliery, that's closed a bit later than the others, 1984. And it's, I hadn't realized this at first till I started reading local books on the places where these mines were, but I hadn't realized how important a holiday resort somewhere even like Dysart had been in the past. And that there's something like a whole kilometre length of shore from where the mine was to the harbour at Dysart. And I hadn't realised that was all a big sort of holiday beach at one time. And that whole shore, that whole 1 kilometre length was affected by the mines. If we have a look here, you can see this doesn't go quite to the centre of the village, but look, there's the Francis Colliery at the top. You can see in the top one in 1913. You can see lots of outcrops of bedrock on the shore underneath, which would be good for having seaweeds on them. But look how it's going southwestwards, the spoil, and covering the whole coastline there, losing the places people like to go. There you can see it on a aerial photograph using this side-by-side thing in the National Library. Again, you can use aerial photographs and maps side-by-side if you want, and you can see the actual cliff of the dumped spoil there with the reclamation, with the treatment lagoons behind. And you can see then that the water which drains out of them, leaving the iron solids behind, comes out through an outlet, which you can see marked there. There's 5 lagoons in that particular picture, but when I took the next one, there were not 5. I think it was 3. And you can see where that outlet is on the top left picture. It's actually almost like a fountain going into the sea. It was incredible. But that's because the place was overloaded and 2 more lagoons have since been installed, which has solved the situation. Bottom left picture, you can see the spoil cliff eroding. Now, on that's top right picture, you're looking along to the village, and there's various rock outcrops there which are gradually getting uncovered. You can see in particular in the bottom there's quite a lot of rock which has been uncovered. You can see the mine in the background there. So there is the opportunity for recolonization here. That actually is a Heriot-Watt MSc student, Kate Buggles, standing there, who helped me in 2011 with the surveys of all these shores that particular year. So let's look at the species totals. Massive rise in species from 2011, didn't change till 2011. Look, 81, 87, 2011, virtually the same and very low. And that's, gave me the impression Dysart wasn't a particularly exciting place. I must confess, when I first went there in 1981, I didn't really bother about the mine. In fact, I thought, well, there's no much point coming here because it's being spoilt by it. But that was when I was doing a survey of seaweeds around the Forth with someone from the Natural History Museum with a view to doing a seaweed atlas of the Forth, which actually only exists in paper form, about 2 copies in paper form. We never got it quite finished. But it didn't seem to change, if you look, for quite a few years. And then suddenly, 2011, 2019, it's gone up to 56. This is a hell of a rise in numbers. And the reds are starting to creep up too. And I must give credit too that some of those identifications in 2019 were done by Claire Scanlon, who is with us tonight. She was helping with that particular survey. So let's just summarize what's happened here. We don't know what was there before, so we can only hypothesize about what we should expect on these shores. But I'd say the comparison with surrounding shores, which we've surveyed in detail in the Forth, and have detail of some of them going right back to, well, the earliest ones, 1820 are the earliest records. We'd expect them to have 60 to 70 species at least, with a full range of forms and very many more reds than browns and greens. All of these have shown a doubling or tripling of species in the last 20 years or so, but that's only brought them up to 40 odd species in most cases. So there is opportunity for more red species to come in as part of the recovery, which we'll have to keep an eye on, see if it's actually happening. There's differences that I've indicated there in each of the sites, and there's a bit of a confusion at Methil and East Weems because we've lost the top of the shore due to land claim works, coastal protection works. But as I tried to point out earlier, we've replaced something that would have been the species poor part of the shore with another slightly more species poor bit, the boulders at the top. But that's not going to stop the reds because they are predominantly on the lower half of the shore. Now, the second one, the mine, the 200-year-old mine in East Fife. We're going to the East Nook, to a bit of the Fife coastal path between St Mon and St Pittenweem. There is a mine drainage outfall there. You don't really expect this in this area, which nowadays is known for tourism and agriculture, but it was actually the site of an industry that went on throughout the Forth, the salt industry in the 18th and 19th centuries and 17th century went along with coal. Seawater was evaporated using the coal to get salt, which was exported. It was quite a big business in the Forth. And at St Monans, there were some salt pans built in 1772 by the Newark Coal and Salt Company. They were abandoned in 1823, but you can still see the remains of them now because they are preserved as an industrial archaeological site. There was a coal mine on the site of what is actually amazingly on the main road called Coal Farm. There was a windmill which has been restored, which pumped water from the sea up to salt pans. But our problem is that in 1794, an underground fire virtually stopped production of coal from that particular mine. There were lots of other mines in the area that could keep the salt pans going. It's quite amazing how many coal mines were in that little bit in 200 years ago, 250 years ago, that little bit of luxurious East Fife. And the water that has come out of that mine is still flowing to the present day. Here's a picture, a reconstruction of what it might have been like. You can see the windmill there. Let's look at the real thing now. There you are. It's there. If you walk along the Fife coastal path from St Monans to Pittenweem, you go past this preserved windmill, past these remains of these salt pans. But look in the very top right hand of this picture. The picture wasn't taken to show this, but it beautifully crept in there. Can you see there's orange stained rocks on the shore? That's where we're going now. Well, in a minute after we pass this map, there we are. That's where it's coming from. it's actually the coastal path is right on top of that hump of grass just at the top there. You can walk right over it, and this is what you'll discover. This is actually the outflow of water from that mine. It's quite funny that on the early Ordnance Survey maps, it's called the Calabeat Spring, which in the 19th and 18th century to some people meant it was health-giving waters, so I think they probably wouldn't enjoy setting up a spa or bathing in this. It runs presently at about pH 6, that is slightly acidic. Usually these things, when they come out first from a mine, they're at a lower pH, more acidic than that, but it gradually gets less so over the decades. But this is actually 20 decades this has been coming out for. There it is onto the shore. And that bit of shore you can see at the top there is a bit that would have the uppermost zone of rockweeds on it normally. But here, look at these green seaweeds instead. A number of species there that you would find up in an estuary, pollution tolerant ones, which can tolerate this kind of situation. You can see there's a hydrocarbon film too there in the middle picture at the top. And it's not come out very well in the picture, but the periwinkles in the bottom left-hand picture are actually really quite brightly orange stained on their shells. And the bottom right picture is that green seaweed. That's an estuary one, which is particularly known for pollution tolerance. And here it is living on the open coast in this situation. About 70 meters away, you get the bottom picture, the normal rockweeds in, but at this particular site where all the mine water is, it's orange pools with green seaweeds around them. And you can see I've got a pile of students doing an annual survey of it. I used to get data on this before I retired by taking students there every year. The point is, it's only the top of the shore. This is this is the richest part of the Forth, the East Neuk, and you've got shores all the way along here getting up to perhaps 100 species on them. And here it's still okay at St. Monans, apart from the top. It's rapidly diluted. Just the top bit here for about 70 meters physical length of the shore is affected. And then you go down to the lower tidal levels, look at it. It's beautiful. The third thing I was going to talk about, the last example, is what happens when you get water which drains the inland mines going to the sea through the little sub-estuaries of the Forth. And we're going to look at the Keithing burn at Inverkeithing. There's a map at the bottom of it. It's actually, I don't know how many of you know Inverkeithing, but that's the inner bay, Inverkeithing inner bay, which had scrapyard, paper mill, quarry, all sorts of things. And it's not a particularly nice embayment, but in the top corner, there's the Keithing burn coming in. The Keithing burn only rises about 4 kilometers inland in the grounds of Fordell Castle, and it's largely fed by water draining from the Fordell mine, which closed in the 1940s. It comes in along there, and you can see there's a little bridge there. I want you to remember that, because that's where it changes from being a little stream to being Inverkeithing Harbour and the bay. But here's two pictures taken from that bridge looking upstream into the little burn itself, 1978, 2006. Look at the difference. The 1978 one is bright with this orange ferruginous waste. Filtration was introduced in the grounds of Fordell Castle to try to improve this, and you can see the effect there in the burn on the right, though to be truthful, it's not completely cured it. Yes, it's got rid of the orange colour. You can see the difference in the two top pictures of what's on the wall of the estuary there. The estuaries don't have all these big seaweeds, but rockweeds can go part way up them. But in actual fact, what was growing under the orange on the wall on the top left picture was actually much the same as lives there now. They are estuarine seaweeds, which are very pollution tolerant, and they weren't really put off by having the orange stuff on top of them. And they're the same as you get, say, at the Amond estuary at Cramond at the bottom there, same position approximately in the estuary. Claire may well recognise the top bit, because I think we did actually have a survey going on just after she'd finished her first degree, in which she was briefly employed, actually quantitatively measuring the seaweeds in little quadrats that were in that orange mess. But it is an interesting thing here. we've been looking at this for years, and there's the bridge over the weir. And when we've done lots of salinity profiles, measuring salinity with depth over the wall there down to the bottom at high tide, when the tide comes up to the height you can see on the wall of the orange. And in actual fact, on a regular basis, it's actually quite saline. It's almost full seawater sometimes. And certainly I can say that the salinity there is enough to support rockweed growth in the lower part of this estuary in theory. But the cleaning up of the estuary has not done that. It's not there. Why? Because if you measure the electrical conductivity of the water there, it is much, much more concentrated than the other local freshwater streams. And I think that's because there's other dissolved stuff from the mine in it. We tried with explants in those little green mesh bags you see there, growing tips from the top of fucus in there to measure their growth rate. It's a technique one of my PhD students devised about 30 years ago, which is very good for measuring the growth rate of seaweeds under different conditions in the field to try and get a feeling for what the place can support. And I'm afraid here it just killed them. So clearly there is something chemical in the water which has not solved the situation. So that's the Forth. Just to finish off briefly, let's just see how big the Forth problem is compared with some other places in Britain. I've chosen 3 places to go to from those other ones you saw on the map, where I think you'll see they've suffered much worse than the Forth. Cunning Point, West Cumbria is the first one we'll go to. I think people imagine possibly that the coastline around Workington and Whitehaven, so on, separated from the rest of England and from the M6 and the West Coast Main Line, where we might go down, by the Lake District, must be beautiful. No. The coastline between Whitehaven and Workington is some of the most polluted rocky shore I know. The most polluted shore I know in Britain is just immediately south of Whitehaven. This is between Whitehaven and Workington, this particular one, where there is a colliery that exudes water onto the shore. And look, there's nothing on the shore at all. And if you look at the close-up there of the rock, it's almost like it's got a solid incrustation of iron on it. This is quite a serious effect, much worse than anything we've seen in the Forth. If we go to Blackhall in County Durham, there's a reason for showing you some stills from the film Get Carter, because that's one of the, over there you see another one of these overhead conveyors for colliery spoil. Only it's not the beautiful encased one you saw at Easington at the start. It's these big hoppers which get filled up at the top in the mine and go down and tip it all in the sea at the tower at the bottom. And to actually get a beautiful picture of how this works, which I used to show my students, there's just about a 4-minute clip from the film Get Carter, just almost at the very end, when you see it happening. Michael Caine is about to kill that man and put him in one of these hoppers for dumping in the sea. And then he's walking happily down. This is the same view in 2002. And you see how different it is. It's all gone. And there's some rock at the bottom where the colliery flight used to be anchored. When Michael Caine gets down there and he starts looking wistfully out to sea, very proud of what he's just done, suddenly a shot rings out from the top of the cliff and he's dead as well then. But I shouldn't tell you that, I'm spoiling the film in case you haven't seen it. Right, let's look at that bit at the bottom. There we are, top left picture, there it is sticking out. And it started to recover after Blackhall Colliery closed. But then something, the bottom left-hand picture there is the normal shore about half a kilometre south of that at Blackhall Rocks. That's what you might expect it to recover to. And it started to go like that. But then it happened that the sand all the way around this place where the colliery flight had been anchored started to exude mine water coming up through it. And you can see it mixing with the seawater there. And you can see in the bottom right-hand picture how we've now got ferric-coated rocks at the edge of that area. And it's completely changing that. Final one is Nose's Point, just about 5 miles and 7 miles north of there at Seaham in County Devon. Dordon Colliery at the top used to just tip its spoil straight down. You can see in that photograph at the top the heat where that was, but it wasn't just from Dordon. There were several other collieries in the area, Vane, Tempest, Seaham and some others, used to send their spoil by train to there, and it was tipped down on the shore as well. And so much was tipped down that if you look at the pictures at the bottom, it built out a completely new shore that went way out to sea in 1995. But the dumping stopped in 1993 and it has been eroding back enormously. Look at it, by 2012. The shore is becoming exposed again. Well, is it getting colonized by seaweeds? There it is at the top in 1995. It's got something like a green tide. 1 or 2 species of green seaweed and completely coating it, looking as though this is some kind of pollution dominated shore, because that's what you get in such situations and nothing else. By 2011, that's gone. And look at the bottom, about 20 species. That's pretty miserable compared with the 40 species on an equivalent unpolluted shore on the north side of Seaham Harbour, 2 kilometres away. You can see on the bottom there, the blast beach, that bit that had built out, eroding away, and you can see the coal spoil in it. It's exposing the shore, but there's a long way to go there. Yeah? I thought it was rather amusing when the interpretative board at the top, which was there the last time I took a group of students to this site, nowhere else like it in Britain, it says, from the Durham Heritage Coast. Well, actually, that's true. It's true from the point of view of the pollution and the mine stuff, but it's also true for other reasons that they've put that sign there, because of the magnesium limestone coastline cliffs that go all the way from there to Blackhall, which have really good flora on them. So, and this area has undergone a massive cleanup program called Turning the Tide at the time of the millennium, which involved lots and lots of physical removing of spoil with earth movers and so on, and it's really working wonders for it. Anyway, come back to the Forth now, the last couple of slides. What do we expect in terms of the number of species there? Now, this is the total species for the Forth. That's something I'm working on at the moment, putting together everything that's ever been recorded in the Forth. I'm comparing 19th century with 20th century records. 214 to 276, 19th to 20th century. Don't misinterpret that as meaning that there's actually more species because it's better in some way in the 20th century, just because the people working have been doing much more directed surveys, and there's been a lot more of them in the 20th century, but also because of one other important thing. Look, the jump in greens from 28 to 68, 40 more greens from the 19th century to the 20th century. That's because the Victorian naturalists never really bothered with the greens. They're not as exciting as the pretty red ones, so they didn't bother with them. What's much more important is to look at the next columns coming up. Of those 200 nods, only 165 were present in both centuries. So in actual fact, the total known in the Forth all that time was 324 species. There's a lot of species. But look, there's 109 only recorded in the 20th century, 50 only recorded in the 19th century. So species come and go. It's like I was saying earlier about ephemeral species, most of which are red, which come and go from year to year on an individual site. And just to finish, here's an individual site in East Fife, Ely, in the East Neuk, one of the richest sites in the Forth. It really is. And our most celebrated 19th century oldologist or phycologist, George William Trail, did a very detailed survey in Ely in 1888. He got 152 species there. We've had to correct that up to present day levels because a lot of the things recorded there are no longer regarded as species in their own right. So it comes to 126 at the present time. When I did this survey with the Natural History Museum in the late 70s, early 80s, we got 136 there. It's broadly the same number of species, but not the same ones. Only about 70% of those two are in common. So there is this idea that species come and go. So a final sentence would be to say that we don't really expect that we should have to find everything that was there in the 19th century at these sites we're looking at recovering. So here we are. Here's a summary of what I've told you. Two principal effects from the mines. There's the acid mine drainage, or the water drainage from abandoned mines, and spoil dumping from active ones. The major effects on the shore are the loss of habitat and the loss of species. The AMD, the water effects, can be very long-lived, for centuries, because the water constantly comes out of the mine with chemical changes having occurred to it in the mine. Recovery can occur from the physical spoil dumping, but you can see it's taking decades, and we have no baseline with which to compare it. But as I've just been pointing out, would the Victorian baseline be valid now anyway? In the estuaries, the orange precipitation is visually intrusive, and people think this is a terrible piece of pollution. Well, it is, but it doesn't harm the upper estuarine flora very much. And if you remove the solids, you may still have some chemical contamination in the estuary water. Well, to escape from all this sea of orange precipitation, so, and here's a nice little picture to bring things to an end. And also, I'd like to acknowledge lots of people who'd helped me with these surveys over the years. That we used to run an annual field course in Northeast England where we looked at these cold sites, an annual day out from Riccarton in Edinburgh to East Fife to look at St Monans and so on, and various students with their project work who worked at these places as well. Thanks to them all. And that's the story. I think I'll just shut this down if I can. Yeah, there we are. If any of you want to ask questions, I'm here.
Thank you, Martin. We tend to think that coastal erosion is a bad thing normally, because, you know, up at places like St Andrews, they're putting in more coastal defences because things like the golf course are getting eroded. But we're looking at it as quite a good thing in those areas, aren't we?
I think there's more than one type of erosion, because if you look at East Weems, for example, we've got coastal protection being built precisely for the reason you're saying, to prevent seawater incursion into the town and so on. That's one kind of erosion protection, but I've been using the word erosion in another sense as well, which is when I talk about the dumped spoil eroding away. It's really just washing away off the shore. It's not the coastline change. It's the coastline is physically changing in terms of what rocks, type of rocks it's got available for the seaweeds to grow on, but it's not that the actual coastline is changing itself. The boundary of the high and low water may change a bit, but it's not the same kind of thing as the problem of erosion due to rising sea level or something like that.
Do we have any idea of where the stuff's going that's getting washed off?
Into deeper water, I suppose. It's interesting that I mentioned, well, the last place we went to in County Durham there, Noses Point, the north bit of Noses Point is the place I mentioned early on where subsidence had occurred between Noses Point and Seaham, about a 1 kilometre length of shore. I have read elsewhere that the shore has subsided due to the weight of spoil dumped on it. And as it eroded away, it's very clear that what's being uncovered, if you look at recent detailed 25-inch or 6-inch to mile ordnance survey maps, and ones from the last century, the rock outcrops, which were so obvious along that bit of shore, are not appearing there now. Well, it has been suggested this may also be happening elsewhere. I think you know John McManus from Dundee University, the coastal geologist there, and he did say to me after I gave a talk on this, if you remember, year before last, at the meeting, subsidence of the shore may well be happening at East Weems.
Sorry, I think other people might be muted. I don't know if anybody else has got a question there.
If they could unmute themselves and ask.
you showed some shots of the coastline across in the west coast around Workington.
Yes.
Was there any evidence of anything coming from Sellafield there? There has been talk of radioactive pollution apart from coal mine.
I'm not sure that Sellafield is quite as bad as people think. That's about 12 miles south, I think, of where we were, and it's the other side of St. Bees Head. I don't think it particularly has a serious impact there. And it's very difficult to actually work on the shore at Sellafield. Well, two reasons. It's a particularly boring shore. There's a whole, once you get south of St. Bees along that coastline, it's all just shingle and so on. And it's completely unenterprising, uninteresting looking shore. But I think also at Sellafield itself, I think if you went down on the shore, you'd quickly have security police around you. No, I'm not aware of any particular problem, not that we were monitoring radioactivity, but on that bit between Workington and, well, I mentioned that the shore south of Whitehaven, just 1 or 2 kilometers south of Whitehaven, was the most polluted I had seen. That's actually because there used to be a detergent factory on the cliff top, but it was built on land which had an incredibly massive network of abandoned mines underneath it, which went out under the sea. And it seems that decades of detergent factory effluent had seeped into these mines and had mixed with the acid mine drainage. And some of it was actually coming up onto the seashore itself through fissures in the rock and exuding onto the seashore. And it really was a shore with literally 2 or 3 species only on it, in some areas utterly bare of any life. It really is quite a dramatic rocky shore there. But this just carries on, not as bad as that, but all the way up to north of Workington with steel works, iron works, chemical works, coal mines, all the way. And it's just so different than you'd expect after you've passed through the Lake District to get there.
Okay, thank you.
I've got a question which may be rather silly. You mentioned that the total number of species often remains more or less constant, and but within that, the species vary, and that seems to be a matter of course. But I just wondered what the reasons would be.
I think, well, I presume the reason it remains approximately the same number, that's the first thing, is because it's a function in a way of the physical diversity of the shore, the available habitat area, the water quality and things like that. In terms of which species are there, it's because the ones that come and go have particular lifestyle in which they are short-lived. They're predominantly summer species which are short-lived. They're not perennial species. We call them ephemerals in that they're only briefly present, and they may be present only in very small amounts. They're not the ones that dominate the shore at all, and they can just come and go.
So it might be seasonal rather than anything else.
Oh yeah. You really need to look at the late summer totals. Basically, I think. There is a real problem with differences in the species number at different times of year. In fact, that's a thing I forgot to point out on one of the earlier slides. I think it was the really big increase in species number at, I think it was, I can't remember whether it was Dysart or East Weems, but it was actually much better than it looked, because the final really big total was a February or March sample. And that's the time of year when we expect species numbers to be at their lowest. And it was being compared with a total 8, 9, 10 years before, which had been taken in late summer when they're at their highest. But it really is important that if you're wanting to get an idea of the richness of a shore, you should do it in the summer. And that's why, for example, the rules for sampling by the statutory authorities for compliance with the Water Framework Directive don't really want them sampling in January. They're meant to sample between May and September, when numbers will be best. There is a rush of species that comes from May onwards. There are one or two winter ones that you won't find in the summer, but they're a few. And sometimes, I mean, there's, for example, there's a lovely green one which appears on the shore from about the end of January through to May, called Monostroma. It's a bit like the sea lettuce over, but it's very different in its detailed botanical features, but it looks superficially like it. It actually is really only on the shore from, or so it appears, from late January till May or occasionally June, but it hasn't actually really vanished. It's actually got a life cycle which has two different phases in it. The leafy plant you see is the one that's present in the spring, but when that reproduces, it produces a single-celled plant which bores into seashells, and that's where it spends the next few months. You can't see it on the shore easily, but it's still there, but it's no longer the recognizable thing you saw early. But that's not most of these ephemerals. They're not like that. There are lots of little red things that come in the summer, and some years they grow a lot and you'll find them, other years they don't. There is also a problem about, you know, how you sample the shore efficiently. Can you actually say when you've been on a shore like this and you've spent 2 hours pottering around with a polythene bag and all sorts of things and put hundreds of things in a polythene bag to take back, and you're going to look at them in great detail under a microscope, can you still be sure you've found everything? No, I don't think you can. I did have a research student, Emma knows her well. So I mean, Claire knows her well, it's Emma. Emma Wells, 20 years ago, who actually did some experiments on this, on how you have to sample the shore to get the maximum count you can get off it in a day on a single tide. And what happens if you do that in successive days at the same place? Do you get the same thing? She was very good at doing this, so she would find almost everything that was to be found. But nonetheless, successive days, she got slightly different samples. So, you know, there's a certain luck of the draw. Any collection you make of seaweeds on a shore is not the absolute 100% list of what is there.
Thank you.
I suppose that seaweeds are much the same as terrestrial green plants and fungi when you come to select something for eating. Are there particular hazards? You'd certainly avoid the unpalatable or chewy ones, but are there absolute toxic ones that you really don't want to eat?
There's one in particular you would not be advised to eat, and that's Desmorestia aculeata, which rejoices in the common name of landlady's wig, because it has actually got sulfuric acid vesicles in it, and that would not be very pleasant at all to eat. But apart from that, there's pepper dulse, which is very strongly peppery one, which might have a flavor you might not like as well. Most seaweeds are supposed to be edible, but being edible and actually being nutritionally useful are two different things. Being digestible is not the same as being edible. And actually even just tasting nice, to me, oh no, I couldn't eat them on two reasons. One, I like seaweeds and you don't eat your friends. And number two, I don't really like strongly tasting seafood anyway. For example, the only fish I like generally comes from a chip shop in Batter. I don't like all the other fishes. I'm not into strong sea flavors, so I don't really like eating seaweed. I have, you know, we do eat it a little bit in Britain, but the classic area where it goes on in South Wales, where something called lava bread is made, which is actually using the red seaweed porphyra, which is a thing you get in sushi wrapped around the ingredients. The brownish, reddish membrane wrapped around it is porphyra, and that is actually eaten in the Swansea and Llanelli areas in South Wales, mixed with oatmeal and fried in bacon fat, and it's called lava bread. I have had it there several times, and the flavour I found very variable. I actually quite liked it once, but it didn't have a strong flavour. Other times it just makes my stomach retch when I put it in my mouth, because that's what happens when I eat strong fishy flavours. But it might not affect you like that, though. It might be, lots of people do eat seaweed, and most of them are edible. And in other parts of the world, there are huge industries based on this. And there's a growing tendency, it's interesting, just in the last few years alone, there's a growing tendency for people to look at seaweed as something to develop for the future, culinarily, but also for many other products that can be got from them. And there's quite serious things going on at the moment about, could we actually cultivate seaweeds for this? When you look at a lot of seaweeds on sale at the moment in places like health food shops, the prices are astronomical. But many of those are ones which have been imported, dried from places like Japan. If we had our own growing, it might be better.
Yes, thank you.
Any more questions or?
I was just wondering, would you be able to estimate how long you think it would be till there was sort of what you might count as 100% recovery? It's maybe a bit of a how long is a piece of string question, but
Indeed, how long is a piece of string? But yeah, I don't know. Because we don't know what the final endpoint is. I was making guesses, and it is 2 years since I've looked at any of these shores, and I must say that eastweams and dysart were really quite incredible when I looked at them 2 years ago. One of those occasions was with Claire, and the other one when I fell in the rock pool, I was by myself. But they had made such incredible increases in the previous few years at those two shores that if it went on exponentially, they might be quite different now, 2 years on. I've got to, once the lockdown is gone and we can start enjoying field work on the shore again, I'm going to go back and look at these places and hopefully see if this big increase has continued. But I think it might be we should get some improvement even in just a few years, I think.
A question from me. Does the pollution, where it still exists, have a knock-on effect in the food chain of things that feed on the seaweed? Apart from the absence of what they like in some cases, are there cases where the pollution in the seaweed would affect other species that are the next step down the food chain?
I wasn't quite sure if you meant, was pollutants accumulated within the seaweed spoiling the diet of the things that eat it, or are there actual species higher up the food chain that can't live there because their seaweeds aren't there? I think,
Both, I think, yes.
Yeah, I'll say I honestly don't know, but I would have thought that one of the strange things, this is, of course, is a botanist, me, talking about zoology, but one of the things I've thought about, if we're looking specifically at the animals that live on the rocky seashore, we're not talking about fish or something like that, if we're talking about things that live on the rocky seashore, they seem to be quite robust, the shelled animals on the shore and so on. That's why, for example, they aren't monitored, the shells that live on the seashore, to assess compliance with the Water Framework Directive, because they are thought to be relatively insensitive to things that would affect the seaweeds. If we're talking about things like fish and so on, or crabs that can move around and so on, they don't have to stay there. They can just go along the shore, go somewhere else. I don't mean that to sound nasty to them, but it's not far to go. These are small areas of pollution, in effect, these three shores. I mean, if you saw all that mess dysart I showed you, I wonder if anyone noticed, and I'm not sure which aerial view I used now. I think I cut it down a bit, but if you'd looked just a little bit east of where all that was coming down from the Francis Colliery, and although you look southwest going to Dysart, it's all, the whole shore's been buried. The other way it has not. And if you turn round that corner into the bay between Dysart and West Weems, things look quite normal there. And it's quite funny. I was just reading today a paper written 39 years ago to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Coddy Naturalist Society. And Helen Caldwell had written a review of seaweeds in Kirkcaldy District Council's area. And she actually said one of the richest areas was that bit between Dysart and West Weems. So, you know, these are localized effects. Go a little way away from them and the shore is okay again.
That's interesting.
Okay. I think if there's no more questions, we'll let you go then, Martin, and thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, all of you, anyway.
Yes.
That was,
Yes,
yeah,
indeed.
that was very interesting. There's quite a lot of nice comments in the chat if you haven't looked at it.
No, I haven't. I didn't have it up because I had the thingy.
I know. Well, have a look before you go. But thank you very much for that. It's a lot of effort going into it. I know that.
I'd like to be able to talk about it, actually.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting to be able to use things like the old maps and as well to demonstrate.
Damn, I know I probably sounded a bit enthusiastic about them, but I am, you know, I like old maps for lots of other things. I use them for my ancestral research as well, which you know I do. But I'm just so impressed with the National Library of Scotland website, and it isn't just Scottish maps. They're increasingly covering the whole of England, and you'll find that ancestral research journals are recommending people to go to the National Library of Scotland as the best maps repository. You might remember when you were doing this work, Claire, back in the 1980s at Chopper, you used to go to the National Library on maps section on Causeway side and get photocopies made at something like £1 a photocopy back in 40 years ago of the very old maps, which they would only let you look at underneath the cell of clear film so you didn't damage it and so on. Well, all those sheets are now available online. You don't need to go to the building anymore. And there's literally tens of thousands of maps you can get online of Scotland now on the National Library website. It's an incredible place. I spent hours looking at it.
I know. Okay. So
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.